Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. And today's webinar is co-hosted by these fine gentlemen that you see in front of you from Pentera and SpyCloud. And there are, some really interesting topics that we want to cover today. So obviously, we're going to start off by letting both Jay and James introduce themselves. But just to give you some context on what it is that we're going to be speaking of, really kind of talking about the latest, if you will, the latest trends in identity related cybercrime and attacker operations. Obviously, we're going to have Jay from Pentera speak about the kind of the way automation is and should be kind of added or kind of take part a major center stage in reducing your identity security exposure. And obviously, James, on the other end, from the SpyCloud angle, will kind of give us an understanding of how kind of that integration or the integration of SpyCloud within everything we do kind of helps to really minimize exposure in the process. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to my fellow co-hosts. If you guys can start by introducing yourselves, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thanks, Asaf. Appreciate it. So, hello, good morning, everybody, and good afternoon for those of you from around the world. It's pretty early here in California. My name is Jay Mar-Tang. I am the field CISO here at Pentera. I've been in the cybersecurity industry for about 15 years. I've been in IT much longer. I've been in IT for about 20 years. And my expertise really has been focused on cybersecurity and many different mitigative controls to try and proactively go against risk. That would include multi-factor authentication and SIM and DLP, data loss prevention, network detection response, endpoint detection and response. And then I spent quite some time in the identity space as well, specifically around the privileged identity. And I then, after working with all these technologies, had the privilege to get on the other side of security and start thinking and behaving like the attacker, which I'll address a little bit later, working here for Pentera. So I'm very eager to work here with James, and I'll pass it to James so he can introduce himself.
Hi, thanks, Jay. Hi, I'm James Shank. I'm the Director of Data Product Strategy here at SpyCloud. Like Jay, I've been in the cybersecurity industry for about 15 years now, and also like Jay, I've been in the IT industry for much longer than that. I've spent most of my time in the cybersecurity industry has been focused on data, analyzing data that's useful for defensive purposes and positioning that data in ways to enable defenders to get ahead of attackers. And that's going to be useful in this conversation because that's exactly what we're doing here with Jay. So I guess without belaboring the point, let's move on.
Excellent. So to get everyone's juices flowing, we're going to start with a question. And what kind of better way to start the question to kind of ask you guys if you could share your feedback as to if and how you're using identity exposure today to validate the security of your organization's identities. So let's start off with a poll or a poll question. So if you guys be so kind as to give us a few seconds of your time, look through the questions, look through the options, and give us an idea of what it is that you're having. Okay, let's give you guys 5 more seconds. I see that we have, quite a few votes coming in. Okay, so if we could share the results, please. Excellent. So what we're seeing is really interesting. So out of everyone who answered, 56% of all the people who responded basically admit to not having kind of identity exposure data today, which is very interesting. And out of again, from all the people participating in the poll, we have only 11% which basically speaks to the people kind of, if you will, on the other end of the spectrum. People are using identity exposure data today to validate the security of their organization's identities. So I've given you both ends of the spectrum. Jay, Jason, if you want to kind of attest to how you feel, what you see today, if you could give us kind of your view, or kind of a bird's eye view of the issue, of the problem, and then potentially take it away from there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's challenging. I think without knowing where to go to get this information, it could be tough without having the expertise. So I'm not too surprised at what I'm seeing here. Uh, then it looks like some folks are also doing manual checks, which is good. So to me, that tells me that there is a desire to do something. There is people recognize it is important to do something. I just think that without having the expertise, a lot of times folks might be handcuffed to not even know where to begin, right? Where would you even look for this sort of information?
Yeah, I'll jump in there as well. I think that in addition to the handcuffs, it's about resources too. A lot of people don't have the resources to implement an effective solution. And I think that's where Pentera's offerings really come into play.
How do both of you feel about the about 28% of the responders also said, just like you said, Jay, that they do perform identity exposure or kind of leverage identity exposure data, but they kind of perform manual checks? What do you feel about, kind of what's your angle on this? And you're probably speaking to customers on a daily basis. Do you also see that in the field? Is it kind of a region dependent? Is that kind of a global epidemic, if you will, of people kind of say, okay, we do have, we're doing it on some kind of a basis, but we're doing it manually, sort of ad hoc. What's your kind of take on that?
Well, I think that there's two problems. One is getting information, and two is doing something with the information. Right. So there's the ability to go and find data that you think is complete or you hope is complete. And you might only actually be looking in a certain area where there's a lot of data in another area. The other thing is that once we have that, how do we apply that to the information that we know about in our environment? And that can be very it could take a lot of time to do that if you're not leveraging tools or you don't have a process built.
Interesting. Okay, James, anything else to add, or do you want to kind of jump in head first?
Well, I think, to answer, I think the answer to part of what Jay pointed out is what SpyCloud does, and the value add that SpyCloud does, especially combined with Pentera's offering. So I think that's a great segue into our next slide. Some of you might not know of SpyCloud, especially the Pentera, people joining from the Pentera side, but SpyCloud, we exist to disrupt cybercrime. This is our purpose. This is what we do every day. And the way that we do that is by getting data from criminal actors, recapturing that data, and then putting together, exposing that data in ways that are useful for defenders to apply to get ahead of threat actors and defend prior to the threat actors being able to use that data themselves. So some of the core use cases that we focus on are enterprise protection against account takeover for both enterprise accounts as well as consumer accounts, consumer fraud and account fraud in general. And then we also focus on tracking the cybercrime actors themselves and exposing data for investigators to understand better what the cybercrime actors are up to. We don't think of ourselves as threat intelligence because when you see the data that we recapture from these criminals, you see exactly what it is that they're trying to do. You see exposures of credentials, them pulling passwords in, and it's not giving you a narrative story about why that's risky, and it's not giving you something that might be risky. It's giving you exactly something that you want to take care of right away. So we position ourselves as cybercrime analytics because we are looking at what the cybercrime actors are doing. We're getting access to that data, and then we're positioning that data in ways that allow you to defend your enterprise. And talking about getting that data, and our understanding of the criminal ecosystem, it's helpful to understand that the data that gets exposed within the criminal ecosystem, it gets exposed in different ways and in different places. One way to model this and think about this is that you have some data that's really open, and this appears on the surface, it appears in open forums, and you can kind of think of this as being similar to a retail store. By the time things are on a retail store shelf, they're available to everybody. But within the criminal ecosystem, you also have vetted forums. These are kind of a middle layer where you have to have a bit of a reputation within the community to get into these vetted forums. The data in the vetted forums is a little bit more fresh. It's a little bit more valuable than the data on the surface. But then when you go even deeper, you get into like the lower level where these are closed groups. These are not only vetted. These are the criminal actors know each other. They know, they spend time with each other, they chat directly with each other. And the data there is a little bit more fresh from the middle layer. Then finally you get into the core layer, and these are the really tight groups. These are the people that are getting the data directly. And this is where the data is freshest. This is where the data is first obtained by the criminal actors. And this is where the data is most valuable for defenders to get and for us to position in an operational way, because this gives you the most time to take defensive action in response to that data. And that's where SpyCloud focuses, and that's one of our unique differentiators. We focus on getting data as early as possible. And in some cases, we can actually get data before the cybercriminal actors themselves pull that data down. Looking at the cybercriminal underground in the data that we get access to, one of the things that cybercriminals have always been interested in is access. And when you think about access in the entirety, part of that is based on users and credentials, but there's other details that the threat actors are starting to position themselves and have been for years positioning themselves to gain access to, like session cookies and API keys. And one of the key points I want to pull on here is that there's a big push in the industry to move to zero trust security models. Zero trust puts an added emphasis on the secrecy of these sorts of items. Without the secrecy of these items, zero trust results in many cases, in many implementations, with a less secure posture than the systems that zero trust is trying, in models that zero trust is trying to replace. So when we're thinking about positioning our defenses, we need to make sure that we are taking this data and responding to it as quickly as we can. And from an integrations perspective, SpyCloud providing this data and optimizing our processing of this data and positioning it for Pentera, together we're stronger at positioning this and helping defenders to respond quickly. Every year, SpyCloud puts together our seminal report, which is called the Identity and Exposure Report. And one thing about this report is completely open. It's completely free. We don't collect emails. We don't collect names. As you can see by the slide, we already have your email and we already have your name. So the unfortunate truth about the Identity Exposure Report is that things are getting worse year over year, and the amount of data that's exposed on the criminal underground is getting more and more voluminous. Just last year, we saw 1.64 billion email addresses exposed. That's in 1 year. We saw 1.38 billion passwords exposed, and we recaptured 32.2 billion PII assets. Now, these PII assets, just to give some definition to that, those are things like national IDs, credit card numbers, birth dates, passport numbers. This data is trafficked in the criminal underground because it allows for identity compromise. And as we're looking at this data, there's even some newer data that cyber criminals are going after and starting to parse out of the data that they're obtaining, such as session cookies, credit card info, API keys, webhooks, and crypto addresses. Looking at the exposure from an individual identity record, a specific identity or a specific person, we're seeing more and more data tied to individual identity records. We're seeing that the average identity, for example, is exposed in 9 different breaches within 1 year. Within 2023, 9 different breaches per identity. And for the average identity, we're seeing 15 different records tied to that particular identity. And what's kind of the worst thing about this particular slide, like the data, what the data shows is that at the very bottom, you see here, there's a 1 in 5 chance that a victim of an infostealer infection that's already been compromised once is going to be compromised again. And that just kind of paints the picture of how pervasive these threats are and how pervasive the information is that criminals are able to get their hands on. Focusing on one aspect of that data, infostealers, just quickly to define infostealers are a lightweight type of malware that when executed on a device, it pulls a bunch of data off of that device. And I'll get into a little bit more details on the next slide, but coming back from that and like talking about it from the perspective of what's in there that's concerning. In our pulled informations, we see that 87% of cybersecurity professionals are concerned about this. And on average, there's about 20 enterprise applications that have exposed credential information and allow access per infected device. So, you know, as you think about defending your enterprise, the amount of infostealer data out there, SpyCloud, we see millions of infostealer log records every single month, and we ingest and parse that. This is a pervasive threat, and it's a pervasive threat that's allowing access to enterprises today. Going into a little bit more detail about what infostealers are, this is kind of a picture of what the cyber criminal sees. At the end of the day, the point of an infostealer is to pull data off of the victim machine that's useful for the criminal actor so that they can trade it and sell it or use it for further compromise. And you'll see that they're very good at hoovering up a lot of different data from these machines. In the right-hand corner here, you can see that they're taking screenshots. They want to know what are the users doing at the time that the infostealer ran. What other details can they extrapolate from the user's identity and the user's behavior from what they see on the screen. They're also pulling data like the cryptocurrency addresses from wallet information on the computers that they're infecting. And then they're doing inventory sort of data on what has the computer, what's the computer running and what has the computer seen, or how has that particular browser been used, pulling data like the history, form fill fields, password stores, and really doing a very complete compromise of the identity information from that computer. And then they repackage that and they sell it and distribute it through the criminal underground. So from a higher level statistics perspective, in 2023, we saw more infostealers than in any previous year. So our data, the data that we're able to collect from the criminal underground tripled in terms of the total number of infostealer logs that we saw versus prior years. Now that's a sign of two things. That's a sign of our collections efforts increasing. So our collection capabilities have increased, but it's also a sign of what's happening on the criminal underground. The criminal underground is making more use of infostealers, and the amount of data that in the frequency that the infostealers are successful at exfiltrating data from victim computers is going up on an annual basis. Last year alone, we recaptured just under 350 million malware exfiltrated credentials. These are victims of infostealers that successfully ran. And this is the count of in a 1 year period, we're seeing 350 million credentials. The other thing that's kind of concerning about this is that the users that are trying to be better about their password policies and use things like password managers, within our data, we also see 100,000 master passwords from 8 of the world leading password managers within a single year for our infostealer data. A few other things that we see, about 61% of the breaches overall, that SpyCloud has visibility into have some sort of nexus or tie to being malware related. And from our perspective, the fact that these breaches have this tie to malware as either the entry point or part of the breach activity shows that this data is of high value and high use by the criminal actors. And we see that also in other ways on the underground, because we see these logs that the criminals are hoovering up off victim machines being packaged and resold within the criminal underground. So there is a market for this information, and it's changing hands and being refined and repackaged for victimizing further companies and accounts and people. And as I mentioned before, there's about 350 million stolen credentials. And I guess the point I want to make here is that with these credentials and with the access information that the criminals are able to steal with this malware, they're having an easy time getting into other accounts, because this is exactly the same credentials that you use to log into your systems as well. And when you combine the idea of stolen credentials with attacks like SIM swapping and other forms of attacks on other factors within authentication systems, you end up with a much less secure posture overall with your authentication systems. And going along that same kind of line, the other details that the criminals are stealing from these machines are data that bypass authentication entirely. One type of data that does this is session cookies. Not to dive into too many details here, but to talk about it broadly, when you authenticate to a website, your computer gets a cookie set by the website that establishes a relationship between your session and an authenticated session on the server side. This permits continuous access for a period of time that's granted by the cookie and by the website. And I guess a few things to mention here is last year alone, we saw 20 billion cookie records. And when we look at this on a application basis and look at it from a distinct log, we're seeing about 328 distinct websites with cookie records per InfoStealer log. So that means that for each InfoStealer infection, there's about 328 distinct web domains that the criminals have stolen those authentication details that allow access directly into accounts and directly into the two different services. One minor point here is that not all cookies are authentication cookies. A lot of cookies have things like tracking, they're doing like user tracking, or they're doing other sort of preference storage things that aren't necessarily related to account access. But with the overall volume of that, there's definitely session cookie data in our data. We've seen that, we've tested that, we know that it's there. And as you start to consider like what is the exposure writ large, this kind of paints this picture that the victimology of the person and identities that criminals have access to from an InfoStealer perspective is kind of a bigger issue than credentials alone. And we're seeing that these attacks are starting to become more common. And sometimes some attacks that you leverage this sort of information are starting to make more news headlines and be seen in social media sites and other sort of services that are common sites that users access. But one of I guess to pull this back together, this is another trend, but I do want to emphasize, going back to the credentials that are exposed are definitively putting you in a more risky position. And with SpyCloud's access to data, our focus on the core data sets and the breadth of understanding and knowledge and collection capabilities that we have on credential data, we're happy to partner with Pentera to present this information in a way where Pentera can do that next step automation to really cut down the time that that data is available and useful to criminals. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Jay here.
Appreciate that, James. And just looking at, I see how I'm almost even a little speechless just looking at some of these statistics, because the sheer numbers of what you're bringing forward is not something that is in front of us as security practitioners every day. But when we look at those numbers, even things like this, 20 billion cookie records, right? Which is just absolutely wild. Some of the things that, even some of the statistics that you had in the report that you folks release, it really challenges us to think. And this is where other statistics, for example, that I'll get into here, even looking at web application attacks. When we look at this, over 86% of web application attack breaches are attributed to stolen credentials. So we're not talking about, hey, we're trying to hit the OWASP related attacks, or we're exploiting a point CVE. This is just with identities, compromised identities. It's just that much. And this is from our friends at Verizon. But when we look at that and we go, wow, the identity cannot be ignored. And how are attackers leveraging aside, and this is just a small statistic of web application attacks. But when we look at the overall threat attacker or attacker life cycle, or intrusion kill chain, as it was once referred to, this is what attackers are doing. They're running reconnaissance. They're trying to cross that perimeter, gain the through that initial compromise, establish that foothold, that beachhead inside the environment. And then they need to escalate privileges, because they can't continue using a low level either identity or account. So they'll start doing internal reconnaissance, try and move laterally, gain additional identities, or some way to maintain presence. That could be establishing maybe trusted VPN access or whichever, and then they'll end up completing their mission after taking some time. And that mission, of course, varies depending on the threat actor and the industry that you're in. Of course, the common denominator with missions that we've seen quite frequently over the last couple of years has been ransomware, which is really nasty, as we all know. But when we look at the exposed identities make these steps that are highlighted that much easier. Think about if I'm able to obtain, and I'm looking at Asaf, right? So I'm just going to use Asaf and throw him under the bus. If I'm able to obtain Asaf's identity, I can then figure out, I already have his identity. So I don't even have to go and figure out who I want to map in the organization. I already have someone. Now, depending on my luck, right? This might be someone with privilege, it may not be, or it may be someone who has access to another area inside the environment. I can then send Asaf a phishing email. That initial compromise may get made or established. But if I do get lucky and Asaf has some sort of privilege, I don't even need to try and escalate anymore necessarily, because I've already gotten some of that escalation done. And this is what we're seeing as well with initial access brokers, attackers, that their sole purpose is to just obtain identities and sell them. So we're seeing a decentralized, I would say that the kill chain and this attack lifecycle is actually being decentralized with initial access brokers, because those identities are they're that important. They're even worth more than like credit card information now, because of what you can do. And when we look at what I like to call dwell time is the point at which an attack begins up until the point where the attack has been discovered. We're seeing 11 months from detection to recovery for compromised credentials and identities. Again, and this one is sourced from our friends at IBM. 11 months that they're hanging out. That's a long time for threat actors to be in the network unbeknownst. But I get it, because when you compromise an identity, and if you're using it and you're being low and slow, these threat actors have become you. They've become the users inside your environment. And if it looks like normal traffic and you're not doing anything to fly or bring attention to yourself, then it can really last quite some time. So, with that being said, with all these imposters and with identities floating around, can we do anything to change this reality? Can we put ourselves in a better place? Well, here at Pentera, and me specifically, right? I'm always evangelizing to get into a continuous testing mindset. Why? Well, we need to understand if we're ready, and we need to look at our networks through the lens of the attacker. How do we do that exactly? Well, from our perspective, from the Pentera side, this is our mission. We're here to enable all of you to either A, start your journey thinking like the attacker, or if you're lucky enough to have a team that's already doing this, we want to enable you to do it better, to be a force multiplier for you through the use of automation. So what exactly are we automating? Well, when we look at how threat actors are behaving, as well as how ethical hackers are looking at their own environment, these are the steps that we're going to take. We're going to see that remember that attacker lifecycle, right? That once they cross that perimeter, we can leverage information. And this is where coming together with SpyCloud, right? Pentera is able to take a lot of that rich credential information and apply it to this life cycle, what we call like this wheel, right? This continuous motion, understanding what can be enumerated with reconnaissance. What would the attackers actually be able to see inside the environment? What vulnerabilities are there? And we're not talking just about CVE static vulnerabilities. And don't get me wrong, they're important to understand, but they're a small piece of the puzzle because there might be other things inside the environment that are making you vulnerable. These might be environmental vulnerabilities, misconfigurations that are making you vulnerable. Those misconfigurations may lead to credentials or an additional identities being broadcasted on the wire, whether they are password hashes or clear text credentials. What we'll want to do is actually go through motions to crack those passwords offline, because this is what attackers are doing. Now, attackers may also attempt to execute relay attacks and drop malware, and this goes back to what James was saying earlier about info stealers. I mean, are you susceptible to that? What information can be obtained off of your estate, right? Are there SSH keys there? Are there additional identities there? And that will lead to the lateral movement and pivoting inside the environment, ultimately until more escalation of privileges can happen. So that may be higher identities, or it may be escalation of privilege from an asset perspective, moving from something like a workstation to a server to a very highly privileged server like a domain controller or something in the cloud or something that's just critical to the business. So with this automation, if we set this up, how can we enrich the data? And that's where our partnership with SpyCloud really starts to pay dividends, because now we're going to take the information, and it's so rich, the information, like James was saying, from the core. As soon as the things that the threat actors are actually trying to obtain first, we can get that information, and now we can cross-reference this information with our own information inside. So really that first step is identifying the exploitable leaked credentials that are out there. And we want to test those credentials and see what impact it would have on our external attack surface, as well as our internal attack surface. And specifically, our credentials that are found on the outside, are they actually still valid in our domain? And even worse, if they are valid, what privileges do they have? All of that. And this is where I mentioned a little bit earlier, where we see a lot. This is challenging to put two of these aspects together. First, obtain the information, being confident that that information is rich enough, and then also being able to then use your own environment to check. That can take quite a bit of time, especially if you don't have a large team.
Interesting. So we've been getting some questions throughout, and I see that James has been answering some of these questions, and we will obviously kind of take those at the end of the sessions. It's good that you're keeping the conversation engaged, and let's kind of throw, another wrench into the story and kind of ask another poll question. So this time, let's look at, kind of, we ask you guys, to what extent is your organization's, kind of, when we look at your Active Directory, how often is that being tested today? And you guys have a couple of answers. We'll be really glad to see what you guys are saying, and then we'll give you a couple more seconds, and we'll also give you our perspective as to how, when, and how this should be done. And by the way, gentlemen, the way I see it now, you're not going to be surprised, or you're going to be badly surprised.
So wait, you think we are going to be surprised, or we're not going to be surprised?
No, I don't think you're going to be surprised.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you guys a couple more seconds to answer the question. And then if we could, show the results. So as I said, as we've seen, we're getting similarly to what you would anticipate, and that's something that we're seeing with, the people we speak to, whether it's, prospects or, sometimes early prospects or customers, and in the beginning of their journey with any sort of, pen testing or other solution, most of them kind of tick the box once a year, and that's what we're getting. 47% of you basically said that you're doing this once a year or less, kind of an ad hoc sort of a thing. 24%, again, a quarter of you guys basically said that you don't do it at all, which is, again, so if you put, the two together, almost 75% of you guys do it once a year or less, and the rest, we had 12% saying that they do it 6 or more times a year, which is interesting. So it kind of speaks to, a very wide range of maturity. It speaks to how you kind of perceive the threat, and it'll be interesting to kind of get your opinion. And James, if you want to kind of take this one and see if was that surprising to you that this was the answer? Or this was
No.
No?
No, not at
Okay.
all. Unfortunately, I think that this is common. I think that that everybody is wanting to do more. A lot of people are wanting to do more, but it's about being enabled and having the tooling and support needed to implement things. And this doesn't surprise me that a lot of people don't quite have the tooling in place and might not even have the support to implement it.
And on the other end of the spectrum, Jay, are you kind of surprised or happily surprised that 12% of the responders said that they do it 6 times or more a year?
I'm always happy when people are doing something, and I guarantee though that these folks, I'm good for them, right? Because it's tough to do that. Usually I see dedicated teams. They might be dedicated identity teams that are doing that. So I'm not really surprised, but I am happy that there are a few folks out there that have the ability to do this, even more than just once a year. Because like you said, Asaf, you and I, from our perspective, we see a lot of the once a year, which is like we need to do something, so we're trying to do it once a year, but it just simply isn't enough. Now with the amount of change that we see in the environment, as well as, for example, the statistical data that James brought up in the beginning, it's like, whoa, right? So, okay. Well, I appreciate everyone's feedback there. Let's get a little bit into now going to what Pentera can do with SpyCloud and what we were just talking about with Active Directory assessments and looking at the data. What you're actually looking at here is what we call the Active Directory password assessment. Now, this Active Directory password assessment enables you to specifically target Active Directory and understand and audit what is happening in your domain. So what type of information are we going to be looking for? Well, the amount of users, privileged groups, as well as leveraging Pentera's unique cracking engine to try and attempt to crack those password hashes. So how many of those accounts will end up being clear text accounts by the time Pentera is done? How many of those accounts would be clear text credentials by the time the attacker is done? And what's great about this is that the information that is obtained through SpyCloud is now cross-referenced. So we can see here that we're validating that the password that was found by SpyCloud it's an actual password in the environment. It's checked. And out of, for example, the passwords cracked, 23 of them happen to come from that data. And that's when I'll show you a little bit of other examples of this, but this is where speed and automation and the enrichment of data combined really make your lives a little bit easier. And it's time. You're saving time. Time is of the essence. 11 months we talked about earlier of dwell time. We want to try and minimize that. So being proactive with the security in this manner can reduce that time because you're finding exposures before potentially the attackers will. This assessment will also give you an understanding, if you don't know already, who your privileged users are, right? And we know that these types of accounts are the ones that are targeted by attackers, whether they're initial access brokers or they're just APTs or just attackers in general, because these are the identities that have the privilege that can get around inside the environment. So this assessment will give you an understanding of that, as well as group memberships, again, repeated passwords and empty passwords, all this data that you can start to proactively do something about. Well, what could you actually do? Well, the first things first, rotate immediately any active, valid, exposed credentials. Rotate them. Once you rotate the credential, they're no longer valid. Now, this can be done, of course, manually. There are also additional tools outside of the scope of Pentera and SpyCloud that can help you with this. So password managers, vaults, secret managers, etc., that can do this. The understanding of these identities including privilege and groups is also important because you can now start having conversations with business stakeholders around, well, look, is this identity really needed? Is this level of privilege really needed? And the reason being is because we want to start implementing least privilege. We don't want privilege creep or privilege scope to increase our risk inside the environment. We only want to grant the privileges that are needed to get the jobs done. We can then also change the policy of weak passwords. So if we're seeing password 123, and don't laugh because I see this all the time, whether it's something like that or it's the nearest sports team. I know, James, you guys have all the data. I'm sure you see a lot of interesting passwords.
All sorts of things. Swifty 123,
Turkey 123, yeah.
Around holidays, around the Super Bowl, around World Cup, you see team names, all sorts of things.
Yeah. So making sure that we don't. Oh, and by the way, right, assessing Active Directory and using custom dictionary words is actually a really great way of doing this because you can identify those accounts and see if having that knowledge about your own users or again about your favorite football team or whichever is actually going to lead to cracked passwords. Now, any administrative accounts revisiting this that we've identified them should be rotated regularly. Okay, so I've seen organizations do this even once every 24 hours. Now, this may vary depending on how you're using these accounts, but getting into some sort of rotation continuously is definitely a best practice. And you'll want to prioritize the accounts that have the most control over environments. So we see this specifically when we talk about accounts that have access to the cloud or just other segments or things that have been blocked off for privacy or confidentiality reasons. We need to make sure that the keys to those many kingdoms are actually protected as well. So once we've started to hit some low-hanging fruits, the second step is to also see the potential impact of exposed identities. Now, in this case, Pentera is running an actual a live test, And you could see that a credential is picked up live inside the environment, and the cross-referencing of the data in SpyCloud allows Pentera to crack that hash. Pentera, or the attacker, now has a valid credential in the domain, and it has privileged remote code execution capabilities. So you can pick up a credential inside the environment, but the cross-referencing of the rich data allows the cracking. And once the cracking happens, and if you have a clear text credential, a lot more doors open up. A lot more. And we're seeing this, right? We're seeing this with information that is being sold or whichever, especially with frontline help desk. So frontline help desk and IT support, traditionally they would be broken up into different tiers, right? So those workstation admins, those help desk admins, right, they may be down in this tier. So you'd have, okay, them down here, your server admins here, and maybe your domain admins up here. And those credentials should only be able to access things within the tier. And hopefully you have logical controls to stop crossing of those boundaries. How do you know for sure if they're working? What we'd want to do is leverage Pentera's gray box, or what I like to call user persona testing or blast radius testing of those either exposed identities. So once you've run the assessment, you should know who your privileged users are. You can take those accounts and run attacks inside your environment with Pentera in the context of that. So what would happen if a SOP's credential is compromised? Let's find out. Or if SpyCloud has certain data of exposed identities, run the test with the exposed identities and understand how much risk you've actually mitigated. You can actually have metrics around the risk mitigated, because if you take the information that SpyCloud has and you run it and you see what could happen, we now know what the attackers would have been able to do. And then we can rotate those credentials. We can do what we need to do. And we've now actually mitigated this attack. So this is where the combined information, coupled with what traditionally was established to try and keep credentials in their unique silos, we could see if these controls are actually being effective. And from the Pentera perspective, this is done with the automation. So it also goes back to what we saw when we asked all you folks, how often are you doing it? Once a year. That's very typical from what we hear. That's why, were we surprised? Not really, because you're oftentimes relying on third parties to get this done, and you're paying a lot of money to get that done. It'll take 2 weeks. You have to wait 2 weeks for a report. Not anymore. Not with Pentera's automation engine. You can now run, whether it's that Active Directory assessment or running the assessments, like I mentioned, the blast radius testing with user personas. You could do this in the morning, let Pentera run for a couple hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, and then see what the attacker would be able to do through the visualization of the attack maps. And eventually, we want to get all of our customers in this continuous motion of sprints where the validation and the checking and the testing, this continuously testing mindset is just a part of the security program. It just becomes the last thing in a long list of, hey, I have to do XYZ and let's validate it. Let's check. I've done XYZ. Let's validate. Let's check. And that could be once a month. It could be however often, whatever the appetite is, you're now enabled to leverage automation to bring that in and do it more frequently. How frequently? Well, you're looking at a real example of one of our customers that have actually integrated this into their program. So you can see here, the green is how often they're assessing the Active Directory. And we have black and gray that is attesting to how often they're running either black box testing, so letting Pentera just run with no information on the network, or gray box testing, leveraging that blast radius user persona testing, how often they're doing that. And you can see it's a mix. Why? Because each test will give you a different understanding of risk inside the environment, including ransomware testing. How often are you testing for ransomware? Right? And are you more susceptible to ransomware with exposed identities out in the wild? These are all the questions now that you are enabled to answer with rich data and through thinking like the attacker and leveraging automation. So I'm taking a look at the time. We have about 8 minutes left. We could see what questions there are and see if there's been anything coming up. I don't know, Asaf. I've been too busy with
No, no,
slides. Yeah.
no, you're absolutely right. So I know we have, 7 or 8 minutes. So I want to be wary of everyone's time and, give you guys the chance to answer them. So I'll just jump into that. So the first is, I understand that Pentera can help to identify weaknesses in the environment. Do you also assist with protection or increase or support detections of bad behavior? That's the first question.
Detections of bad behavior? We wouldn't, well, I would say yes, but here's the reason. If you're looking to increase your response time, the only way you're going to do that is by running adversarial emulation attacks. So while Pentera doesn't necessarily detect, right? Pentera is the attacker inside your environment. So what we see is leveraging Pentera continuously, running these attacks continuously will enable you to start the purple teaming mindset to say, all right, we have the attacker. We know it's within, it's safe because it's Pentera. It's not a real attacker. When we run these attacks, how fast are our controls responding? How fast are our defenders responding? Or if we're using a managed third-party SOC, how fast are they responding? And are they giving us all the details that we want? So leveraging the red and blue team, attacker, defender, jointly, that purple teaming mindset will help you reduce your dwell time and increase your response time.
Excellent. We have another question specifically about, about Pentera. Can you pivot and laterally move around networks and domains in Pentera?
Yes. So what we see is a lot of times Pentera will pick up credentials off one machine, move to another. We have the ability to architect and distribute architecture as well into other segments. So if that's a use case that you want to run, it's absolutely accomplishable with Pentera.
Excellent. Two more on, or actually one more and then another one for you, James. The first for you, Jay, is how does Pentera work in a distributed environment, particularly with SASE or SSE?
With distributed environments, say that one more time.
With SASE environments or SSE? Yep.
Yeah, so distributed environments is no problem. Again, I had just mentioned the distributed architecture. So depending on how you would, depend on your network, and every network's different, you would work with your Pentera engineers to figure out a way to just make sure that different parts of the environment is hit. Now, it's very important to understand Pentera is agentless, so we're able to use different types of architecture or nodes that we call them to get into and have visibility into different environments. As far as SaaS environments, software as a service, as we know, the data is not necessarily yours, it's the SaaS provider. So that is something out of scope for Pentera.
Excellent. The next one is for you, James. How long does it typically take you to discover new credentials from the date of the leak on average? And, and for Pentera, kind of when you kind of complete the answer, how long does it take us to validate those credentials?
Sure. So I don't have that statistic readily available. I apologize for that. What I can say, though, is that it varies depending on the data sources and data types and collection technique. When you think about the criminal underground representing a distribution channel that starts with the original sourcing of the data by the criminal actors, and then that being wholesale distributed through the criminal underground until it gets to the retail sort of distribution at the surface, there are time delays in all of those cycles. So in the cases where we get very close to the threat actors, sometimes we get that data within seconds of it being lifted off of the device. Many times it's within minutes, but we do strive always to improve the time interval between when the event happened and when we get that data.
Now, as far as
Jay, yeah.
Yeah, how what was the question? How long does it take for us to validate the credential? Minutes.
Correct.
It just depends on how often you want to run the assessment. So as soon as you run the assessment, we'll take that imported data and we'll start cross-referencing right away. And if you saw, so yeah, minutes. Good questions.
Excellent. I do have another one, which is very interesting, and I don't think that either of you have mentioned, potentially more on your side, Jay, is kind of the the safety. So you mentioned the fact that you're operating from the eyes, the shoes, whatever you want to, wherever you want to place the attacker within your infrastructure, kind of that attacker mindset, but you haven't mentioned anything about, safety or business continuity. So it would be
Yeah.
interesting to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, and this is something that I'm seeing. We release our pen testing report every year, and we just released ours, and we asked a question as to why are you not doing more penetration testing, or why are you not doing more red teaming exercises? And safety is a big concern. And I get it, right? You don't want to compromise the availability of information. Luckily, with Pentera, safety by design is our big mantra here. It is a core tenet and value that we hold very sacred. So when we run tests, whether it's the assessments for Active Directory or just the general black box or gray box testing, it's important to know that all the exploits that Pentera uses inside the environment has been designed to be safe. So you don't have to worry about the availability or compromising the availability of your information because you're leveraging safe malware, safe exploits. So you can run this in the background without having to be too nervous that you're going to take something down.
Excellent. Listen, I think that we've basically reached our, we've gone to all the way to the top of the hour. So I really want to thank everyone for joining. Thank you for the very good questions, for the engagement. I've seen, a bunch of questions that James, as Jay was talking, you were answering some of the questions. We will definitely make sure to, first of all, answer all the questions that we haven't had the chance to, some of which were, sent to us directly over the Q&A. And we will definitely share the recording with you guys for those who registered and were on the call, but also for for the ones that registered but didn't or weren't able to make it. So I want to thank first of all James. It was a pleasure, and Jay, sir, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you,
everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
everybody.